Welcome to our fifth and final program in connection to Contact High exhibition presented by Mass and Soul. Tomorrow is the last day for this exhibition, and I think we can all say that we're very sad to see it go. But this exhibition and a series of films and activities have served a way to connect the history of hip-hop, music, photography, style, and culture within our region here. It is wonderful to see some participants from the programs in the audience today, including some of the winners of the analog photography exhibition. Tonight, both Mass and Soul are very glad that Contact High curatorial team can be here with us to take us on a journey through places and spaces that inspired the global movement of hip-hop. Joining us from Harlem is Fab Five Freddy, who emerged in the late 1970s as the New York City graffiti artist and was a key player in New York's 80s downtown cultural scene that would eventually give birth to street art. Many of you will know him from the cult classic film, Wildstyle. He has directed music videos for numerous hip-hop artists, such as Snoop, Nas, Queen Latifah, amongst others. And he was the original host of Yo! MTV Raps, the ground-opening TV show that took hip-hop culture global. I am sure Fab has a story or two about nearly every hip-hop artist here. And we're also joined by Vikki Tobak, author and curator of Contact High, without whose vision we would not have been able to enjoy and learn from the 4 decades of 200-plus photographs by over 60 photographers surrounding this exhibition. And last but not least, we are joined by Joseph Patel. Joseph is a producer, director, and writer on documentaries and short films. He most recently produced the feature documentary Summer of Soul, or When the Revolution Could Not Be Televised, directed by Questlove, which won both the Grand Jury Prize and the Audience Award for U.S. documentary at the 2021 Sundance Film Festival. And Summer of Soul is actually premiering globally at the end of this week. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Fab Five, Vikki, and Joseph.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here at the last days of the Contact High exhibition. Want to say a quick thank you to Maz and to Soul for collaborating with us on bringing this here. This show here is the first time we've brought Contact High outside of the United States. And it's such an honor and pleasure to have it here in the UAE. So thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to just moderate this conversation because I think we're all lucky to be here, and we're lucky to have Fab and Vikki here. So I'm just going to start, and then we're going to do a little Q&A at the end. So if I don't ask anything that you guys want to hear, there's a mic there, and when it's time for the Q&A, line up there, distanced, ask your question. I'll repeat it if people can't hear, and we'll keep it going. Cool. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
So let's start with the concept of Contact High. The three of us have been working on this for a few years now, but where did the concept of Contact High start, and how did we give us the brief arc of how we ended up here?
Yeah, you guys can hear me okay, right? Yeah. So I just want to echo Joseph that it's incredible to be here. Thank you to Soul. We weren't sure if we were going to make it here, so to be here in person is just super, super special. And the Maz team and the Soul team just really did right by us and the photographers, so thank you. So beginnings of Contact High. My background is of a journalist, a longtime music writer. I wrote for a lot of early hip-hop magazines. Before that, I worked at a small independent record label called Payday Records, and worked with a lot of the artists who were shooting their album covers, shooting their press photos, and I had met a lot of the photographers that are in this show back then in the early 90s. And as I continued, my journalism career and started working for other places, I worked for like CNN, I started to see how they treat their archives, and how they treat, their contact sheets, their archival, footage. And this was a couple years ago, and I got to thinking, like, hip-hop now has this archive too. This is a culture that's now over 40 years old. And, hip-hop has this history that's really told in the in-between moments in the contact sheets. So I started reaching out to the photographers one by one, really as like a research project. I always hoped it would be, a book. I never imagined it would be an exhibit, but I was hoping it would be a book, and just one by one started looking in photographers' archives, interviewing them, for their stories. And I started writing it as a magazine column, hoping that it would turn into a book, which it did. And that's really how it got going, And then an exhibition, we got approached by the Annenberg Space for Photography in LA to open it there in 2019 as an exhibit, and then New York, and now we're here. But it's been an incredible journey, and really quite emotional for someone who, loved the culture and the music and everything so early on. To see it come, all the way here is really just amazing.
Fab, can you talk about the name Contact High? And it obviously refers to contact sheets, but how important contact sheets are to telling hip-hop stories that maybe we don't normally know.
Right. So, we're in a digital time, we're in a digital era. Everything's digitized now, but before, photographers would, professional photographers, if you will, would shoot a roll of film, and as opposed to getting a bunch of prints, they would get a contact sheet where they can look at the little size images, and then they would pick, okay, print this, print that, print this, which are why these things have these marks on them. This is for younger people that don't really know what a contact sheet is. If you guys know, well, you know. So that was the process, and then from those things, so that was a part of professional photography, which once again no longer exists. Now photographers can shoot hundreds of pictures at a time, and they're all on these little digital devices, and that's where we are. So when Vikki, I first began to see her column, she had talked to photographers that had shot, like there's one particular shot of Snoop Dogg sitting against like a bed, and that's a music video I was directing. I directed Snoop's first video, and the photographer was a really good friend of mine. And in this Mass Appeal article was the other photos, and there's a photo of me while I was directing the video, standing by the monitor, waiting for Dr. Dre to, give me his feedback on a shot. And I'd never seen that image, and it took me back to that time. It was so amazing, and I thought, wow, this is a great idea. And so that's how I really became friends with Vikki. I thought the idea was amazing. There was another, and she would this would come out like every once in a while, and it'd be like, oh my God, I know the main photo, but look at these other moments that the photographer captured. So that just opened up something that had never been done. And then also, I think what we realized as we, was definitely had to be a book, and then had to be an exhibit, and really there's never been a comprehensive show of the history of hip-hop in photography. So you guys are, seeing this first show of its kind. This music culture is the most listened to music on the planet, believe it or not, which still blows my mind 40 years later. So that was a long answer, but that's, why I'm here. I figured I'd get to travel a little bit too.
Keep giving long answers. Those are good. Vikki, for you, can you explain the thrill you get from looking at contact sheets and what they actually reveal about, like, the you said digging through archives. What do they reveal about the culture and the history of the culture for you?
I mean, anyone who was there in the places and spaces where hip hop was born knows that it's not always the finished product that you see on a magazine cover or an album cover. There are, the people, the crew, the friends, the producers, all the real community that made hip hop what it is. And you got to see that in the contact sheets. You get to see Fab like creating Snoop's first visuals, which you didn't see in the finished product. And so I thought it was just a really good storytelling mechanism to tell this deeper story of what hip hop was and who built hip hop and what it looked like. What it really looked like, not just these perfect images that, we see as finished products, but really show the process of the contact sheets and show the process of how people create, and how artists craft not just their music, but craft their image, and who all, was part of that. And I thought it was really important, especially since we live in this Instagram, social media age where images travel instantly. Back in the day, a lot of the images would, these were really, contact sheets were like working documents. They weren't meant to be shown in the public. That's why they're like messy and marked up. But, to see the in-between moments is so great. And photographers also like to see each other's contact sheets because it's like being let in on a little secret. So I just thought it was a really good way to tell that kind of deeper, more nuanced story of the culture. And I did have I was trying to remember the other day what other ideas I had for the title. I was like, Contact High was just one of the ideas. What were the other ones? I couldn't, they were all like kind of boring, like hip-hop photography. But yeah.
Something real academic.
Speaking of contact sheets, my favorite story is the Al Pereira contact sheet that has the image that has Nas and Tupac together. Is when Vikki was doing her research for the book, she looked through that contact sheet with Al, and they discovered in this series of photos, it was Al was shooting a couple of different events that night in 1992. And at Club Amazon, there's Biggie and Tupac and Redman. And in the contact sheets, they're looking at it together, and they see there's Tupac with Nas. And this is pre-Illmatic Nas, about a year or two before he releases his debut album. And Al had boxed him out because he didn't know who he was at the time. And he had just framed Tupac and Redman in the photo. And this was 3 years ago? Yeah. I think when you were, or 4 years ago? Yeah. And what's funny is Nas doesn't even remember this photo. And he didn't think it was real when it first got out. Vikki published her column, that image started circulating on social media, and Nas didn't know if it was real or not himself. But it just goes to show you that the decision the photographer made was he didn't know who Nas was at the time, so he boxed him out of the photo. But then going back through this, he sees this, and it's the only image that exists of Nas and Tupac together, which is why we have it as a print.
And also, I would just like to add, once Nas came out in '94. I directed one of his first videos. Then there was a huge kind of a feud that went on East Coast, West Coast, and Tupac kind of rapped about, it was like a real aggressive thing. So once Nas hit the radar, Tupac went to war against Nas, and it was a whole bunch of history, but that was before Nas had really became a big deal. So it's a special archival moment thanks to Vikki digging in the crates.
Well, it also just speaks to this age that we live in, that Nas thought it was photoshopped. That somebody had taken a photo of him and a photo of Tupac and put them together. And he had reached out to a bunch of our mutual friends saying can you ask Vikki, is it Photoshopped? Because it meant a lot to him. I mean, years later, as, grown men and understand what this has become and, all that they went through, for him to have a photo with Tupac is sort of bigger than just that moment that they lived through, as really kids. And also in that photo, I love that photo because it's like a little, little Where's Waldo, you could really pick it apart, is a good friend of his from growing up who passed away around the time that Illmatic came out, draws. And then, of course, there's Redman. And then also on the very end is a kid who's a member of this crew called the Lowlifes crew, which we have the Lowlifes Polaroids here and their Snow Beach jacket. And the Lowlifes, you know, they are like incredible. Like, I want to do a show just of Lowlifes. But they were a group of kids, mainly out of Brownsville, Brooklyn, who were obsessed with polo. They were like called Lowheads, wore polo, you know, were known for shoplifting polo in mass quantities with like groups of like 30 and more young dudes. And then they would, you know, be head to toe polo, and then they would self-document in Polaroids, which I think is fascinating from a photography perspective, is that no one was really taking photos of them, you know, and to have your photo taken is a moment of stating an importance, I guess. So they were stating their own importance, which I love. They were self-documenting. For people on this side, you know, these two photos on the end here are like their Polaroids blown up. So one of the members of the Lowlifes is also in this Nas Tupac Redman photo. So it's that photo and that moment just really says a lot.
Yeah, I think it's like that story to me is very emblematic of this show and the things that this show reveals. All right, so I want to talk about how when we got asked to do this, we built it from scratch. We didn't take the New York show and bring it here. We built it from scratch. It's printed locally. Can you talk a little bit about how, in your head, creatively, you wanted to sort of organize the different sections so that there was sort of a narrative that happened?
Yeah, that was, I mean, it was a big undertaking. First of all, the scale of this space is incredible, so we're so happy to have it here. We also knew that, you know, this was the first time it was going to be seen by a global audience outside of the United States. So we were like, what do we do differently than we've been doing in the United States? Do we do anything differently? And ultimately, we just really wanted to do a good job of telling the story, you know, of the culture and celebrating the photographers. So we decided to kind of weave, I guess, a chronological tale here. But I think when you really go through the show, you feel like you're moving through time of hip-hop. But you'll also pick up little stories within the story of, you know, women in the culture. You know, early on, we have women in hip-hop, a photo from 1988. And then here, towards the end of the show, you know, we have a picture of, you know, Megan and Rhapsody and Cardi, and, you know, Beyonce and Jay, of course. But really kind of telling these, like, micro stories in this room as you walk through that evolved over time, right? Women in hip-hop evolved over time. The way people looked, the way people expressed themselves over time, you know, Frank Ocean, the moments that he really, you know, just everyone that pushed the envelope. So that was the idea, right? Chronological order to see how things evolved, but also these stories within the stories. The only thing that we didn't do here that we did in the States is, in the States, we kind of nerd out a little bit more about like the difference in regional hip-hop in the States. Because anyone who's from the States knows that like New York style versus LA style versus Houston or Atlanta looks very different. And here, you know, we kind of just, you know, didn't quite nerd out on that as hard as we did in the States, but that's really the key difference.
Fab, you pop up in a few photos in this exhibit, and since you're here, I think it'd be a great opportunity to ask you about a couple of these. If you could tell us the story behind them. One of my favorite is one of the first photos that you see is you standing in front of a White Castle that was taken by Sophie Bramley, and that contact sheet, which is just great because it's just you and her like hanging out all day, right? Like,
in the Bronx.
Yeah, can you tell us the story about that?
Yeah, I was just telling the woman Grazie.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Allison, I'm sorry, right. So this, Sophie Bromley was this North African French woman that was in New York in the early 80s who was not really a photographer. She just was a real cool chick that had a good camera. So she was hanging out in the mix, partying, seeing this culture as it began to come from the Bronx into downtown Manhattan, and she just would take out her camera and just snap some great photos. It was Noah I was telling that story. I'm sorry, guys. It was Noah. And because Noah lives in Paris, I'm going to link her up with Sophie. And so Sophie worked in the record industry, worked different jobs over the years since. And then when we reconnected, she pulled out all these photos, and I was like, wait a minute, unbelievable. And then it occurred to me, like, she was one of the most serious photographers that documented the culture at that very early point. And so that image coming out of White Castle is this is the place where you'd get hamburgers. There was a bunch of them in New York. It was really the place that invented fast food. I just recently saw a thing on TV. I didn't know that. We also used to call them murder burgers because they're really like the thinnest piece of meat, and they're really small. And so as kids, we tried, man, I had 10 of them. I had 15, but you'd almost always get an upset stomach. So not the best quality food, but it was fun to eat them. And I guess Sophie just grabbed that moment, and we were hanging out that day. You look on the contact sheets. One of the people that works at Soul said that many people ask, if you look at the contact sheet, you see my name and then Islam. She said people are curious about that because of the Islam religion, but the guy that I'm with, his name is Africa Islam, who was a very popular DJ at that time. So yeah, that was just a moment that was in the early beginnings of all of this. Luckily I was around, and Sophie took some good images, and so yeah, that's the story.
Can I just add because you made a really good point, is that Sophie was not a professional photographer. And a lot of the photographers in this show were not professional photographers. They were people from the community who were in spaces and understood that there's something important happening here, and we need to point our camera at what is happening. And they weren't necessarily trained. They were figuring it out as they go. Joseph and I always say, the photographers came up as the music came up.
That's a very good point. In fact, Estevan, who I don't know, is some of his work in this?
There's a Nipsey Hussle photo of his.
So the photo of Nipsey, but when the show was in LA, we all did a talk like this together, and Estevan is a renowned photographer with incredible images that capture the essence of that California hip-hop, but also California car culture where the lowriders and everything come from. And his story was, when the hip-hop tours began to happen, he was like a bodyguard, or he was like a bouncer at some club or whatever, and he knew, like, wait a minute, this is important. He had a decent camera. He had intimate access. He started taking pictures of a lot of the California guys. That became some of the earliest documentation of that, and that was the classic story. Like, he goes from being like a bodyguard, bouncer type of guy to being one of the most important photographers on the California side that captured the story.
Yeah, like there's partly the stories of all the photographers. Each photographer has a different story of how they came up. A lot of them, like Fab said, were just there and they pointed their camera at something and it turned out to be important. And Clark Kent, our friend DJ Clark Kent, says, no one knows that this is going to be history. History happens, and either you captured it or you didn't. And we're fortunate that a lot of people found energy from this culture, and they pointed their cameras at it. And 40 years later, we're looking at the results. Another thing that's not in the New York and LA shows that is unique to the UAE here is the Wildstyle images that are in the front as well. And we were talking about this in the car earlier today. Wildstyle is such a lightning in a bottle moment. Like it's a feature film, first covering hip hop, and it's a feature film that captured this subculture at a very, very exciting moment of genesis. Can you talk a little bit about how Wildstyle came about?
Yeah, well, you know, when I was coming up, my main creative kind of move was to be a painter. I was one of those people that did graffiti on the walls in the trains, and then I had this like, hey, I'd like to be a visual artist, and let me try to figure out how to do this. And one of the ideas I had, well, if we can make a movie that puts a light on this culture, the music and everything, and shows that it's one thing. And I met this guy named Charlie Ahern at an art exhibition that said, that's a great idea, let's make a movie. So this is your classic independent underground film with very little money to work with. He believed in the ideas. This is before any kind of like big articles or hit records, but we believed that what was going on in the Bronx and different parts of the city was important. So we started to go to these parties together and meet the rappers in the Bronx. I mean, I knew about it, but I didn't know any of the artists, the rappers, the DJs, some of the graffiti people I knew, but our mission was to go and meet everybody, see who was the most interesting that we wanted to focus on in this film. I ended up in the film as one of the main actors. That was not a plan. Me being in front of the camera was never a plan, but it ended up happening. There's a film that's playing, that clip is really images from us researching what became hip-hop's first movie, Wildstyle. And so that's really what that is. And we were going to parties in the Bronx. I like to tell people, to remind people, that when hip-hop was invented, everybody was a teenager, believe it or not. Nobody was really over 20, 21. If you were 20, 21, you were considered like, oh my God, this guy's really old. What, you know, you're not supposed to be around us kids. But it was that time, it was a special time, a special energy. And there's one of the images of one of the groups rehearsing like in their home in the Bronx. You know, they're doing their routine, one of the groups, the Fantastic Romantic. So that's what that's about. And once again, it ends up that that's also some of the earliest official documentation of this culture. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that slideshow is really cool. One of my other favorite parts of the exhibition, and Vikki, I'll tee this story up for you, is in this section over there is you've got these contact sheets of Biggie Smalls. And you've got the cover of the magazine, Rap Pages, that he was on, that photo was on, and you've got the crown. And just to the right of it is a little recess where you can see the Tupac photo in the on the next wall. And I just love that because that photo of Biggie is such a hero moment for him. And that image of Tupac is such a hero moment, and they are inextricably linked in history, obviously. And I just love the design of that. But let's talk about the Biggie photo and that contact sheet. And, you know, what that never saw the light of day until Contact High came out.
Yeah, and I call that photo, it's like the Mona Lisa of hip hop. You know, that stern Biggie that ended up on the cover of Rap Pages magazine. You know, a lot of these photos were shot, like I said earlier, either as a magazine cover or magazine spread, or as an album cover, you know, and that is sort of when photography got different. It became more commercial. There was like commissioned things versus just the early kind of documentary style photos. But so everyone knows that photo, right? It's everyone knows it. It's a very stern, very specific kind of photo of Big. In fact, someone here is wearing a T-shirt of it. I saw walk in. So of course I was like, I have to see if there's a contact sheet of that photo, because it really is the probably best known image in hip hop. And Baron Claiborne is the photographer, and I reached out to him, and he's very casual about everything. So he's like, oh yeah, I'll send it to you, yeah, here, take a look. And when I saw that there was that one frame of Biggie being his true self, as people who knew him will say, being a goofball, smiling, cracking up. And it really struck me as well, first of all, the choices that are made in what images go out, because I was like, why didn't they put the smiling Biggie on the cover of the magazine? Why the stern cover? Why, who made those choices? So it just kind of got my brain thinking. But, you know, that the contact sheet just really kind of humanizes the artists and shows, you know, these different sides to them. And people love that contact sheet just because, you know, it's so unexpected and funny. But what I also love is when people who really knew Big say, that's the Big that I knew, you know, and it's really special. And then one other aspect of that photo that I love, Baron Claiborne, the photographer, was a young black man, you know, in New York, just like Biggie was at the time, documenting the culture. And he tells the story, when I interviewed him for the book, or for the column rather, he says, you know, there were so many media images of young black men, just like me and Biggie, that were out in the world that were negative. You know, you'd see on the news, you'd see here, there, and it was always negative, stereotypical images. And even a lot of like hip hop videos at the time were like, just kind of stereotypical, right? Like, I'm on a yacht, I'm on a boat, I'm doing this, like flex, you know, and he said, you know, I wanted to capture Big as royalty. I wanted to capture a young black man just like myself as being a king. And then, you know, he jokes like big fat African king. So they did, you know, and they used that kind of iconography of royalty, of the gold colors and the crown, and the fact that it was so thought through by Baron and so intentional in kind of capturing Big that way, and now that image stands, you know, many years after he's gone. That photo is called King of New York. So it's just special.
I'd like to add to that which also goes back to the motivations for the ideas that I had, which became hip-hop's first movie, Wildstyle. I wanted to control the narrative because luckily I grew up, I had really aware, intelligent parents that were really kind of well-read, and we were not going for any of the BS that had been going on. So and particularly in the era that I came up with, I wanted to build and, you know, make a strong move in trying to tell our story. Because at that time when we made Wildstyle, whenever you saw an image of a young black or brown person, it was almost in the press. It was almost always related to something negative. And I knew that was not the story. I wanted to show that we're creative, we're artists, we're doing our thing. And so the movie was to put another light, because there was nothing positive said about graffiti, particularly at that time, and the music hadn't really happened. So I think that was important. And then as hip-hop began to develop, artists also had that inkling to, particularly not just with the photos, but when music videos happen, here's how I want to look in my video. I want this image. So we began to tell these stories, which was important. And I just like to add that, which I think connects to a lot of what you're seeing on these walls right now.
Tangentially to that, so one of my favorite things about Yo MTV Raps was when you would go to different places that I had never been. And at first that was in the States. You're doing shows in places that I had never been, and I'm looking at the rap artists from there, and I was really like locked in. And then you start taking it internationally. The Japan episode is like legendary, right? The France episode is legendary. And you're seeing this culture, you're seeing hip hop in these different places. We have this show here in the UAE. So I'll ask you this question, Fab. What is the thing that you hope international audiences understand about hip-hop culture that maybe isn't so obvious to them?
Right, good question. I think that, once again, I heard we were talking about something earlier, and you mentioned DIY, which stands for do it yourself. And I think even more so than in the beginnings of hip-hop culture, to make a record, you had to eventually go into a recording studio and where there was a big mixing board, and that cost real money. And so there was a lot more cost to make the music to be able to get it out to the people. You had to the records needed to be manufactured. They needed to be distributed so you could really reach people and people could go, oh, this guy makes a good record. I want to go and buy his record. Now you can go on YouTube, which is free, and you could shoot a video literally on your phone and post it on YouTube, and if the song is right, it could happen. So that's, I guess, what I would share, but what's already going on. I'm sure if anybody's aspiring to do that, you understand these things, that the means of doing it yourself is really at your fingertips. It's actually in your pockets right now, which still is kind of mind-blowing, the acceleration of technology within the time when hip-hop came out. But also, I've always been very tech curious, and in the very beginnings of me kind of navigating the very rough crowd that went to early hip-hop parties, you know, there's a lot of tough guys in the neighborhood, you know. Once you got to the DJs and I would strike up a conversation, they were almost like nerdy technologists that you could have a technical conversation with. And so that was kind of, and a lot of those early DJs became, or some of them became, the producers of hip-hop music with a lot of that same thought process. So that always gave me a lot of inspiration, and I think, once again, that's continues now as people figure out ways of using these devices and tech. Although everybody's got the device, so you've really got to be creative to do something that stands out or stands up above the rest, and that's still the objective.
Vikki, same question for you. Maybe from a cultural context standpoint, what is something that you hope international audiences take or understand about hip-hop that maybe they won't just get on the surface?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess my answer will extend on what you said, is that the DIY culture that was really born out of necessity, you know, that it wasn't just technology, that it was like a lot of the magazines here were started by young folks who just loved hip hop because there was a need, right? They filled a void because nobody else was starting them. And they didn't know how to, they just did, right? You and I wrote for some of the earliest ones. We didn't know how to write big magazine profiles, right? You just did.
Certainly did not know how to.
Yeah. A lot of right now, something that I think about when I come out for Soul, you know, when it happens in December, because it's such a big streetwear-focused festival, and how fashion and streetwear now is such a multi-billion-dollar industry, the fashion brands that were created by young entrepreneurs who didn't know anything about the fashion business, but knew, like April Walker, you know, who's styled a lot of the clothing in here, even the Shirt Kings, you know, these were just folks that were catering to a customer that mainstream fashion was not catering to, and in fact actively did not want, you know, people of color wearing their clothing.
In fact, if I could jump in right
Yeah.
there, when Vikki was talking about the lowlifes, when she said they were into polo, I want you to know that she didn't mean polo like riding the horses. She meant Ralph Lauren, who was one of the biggest fashion brands, and Ralph Lauren he was a Jewish guy from the Bronx that created this very rich, waspy image to sell his clothes. So when you looked at the ads, you'd be like, man, I want to be like that guy in that mansion, and I want to wear that sweater. His brand was called Polo by Ralph Lauren. And the lowlifes, which literally ran into stores and stole the clothes, that's what shoplifting means. I want to be clear. They would run into stores and steal the polo. Like 20, 30 guys would take the clothes, wear head-to-toe polo, take pictures everywhere, styling. That made Ralph Lauren's polo brand one of the hottest brands in the streets of New York. In fact, Ralph Lauren's son was trying to do a movie about the lowlifes, because it's not what I advocate anybody doing, but that series of events made the Ralph Lauren brand super hot. We'd be like, yo, I want to look like those guys. I want all of that. And so that's just an example of what happened in fashion. All the hip-hop fashion brands, Jay-Z's brand, Rockefeller, Fat Farm, dozens of these brands were all aspiring to
Dapper
be...
Dan, of course.
Yeah, Dapper Dan. All were aspiring to be like these big luxury, these big brands that were out there. But to take what they did and rewrite that narrative and make it ours was the motivation. And now you have, let's say, a great example is the Supreme brand, which was a brand built around and for New York skateboarders, is now a multi-billion-dollar brand.
And I'll sort of answer my own question there, because I think, you could buy the records, you could read the magazines, you could look at these photos, and I think the thing I want people to understand is that hip-hop at its center, at its soul, is black culture. And I think that, it's important to, as the music grows and expands and becomes more commercial, you see less and less black faces. And I think it's really important that we all recognize as fans of the culture and as fans of the music that at its core it is a black culture, black American culture, and we have to find ways to keep preserving that, because otherwise it'll go the way of every other.
Contact High does a good job at that.
All right, so I think it's time to open it up to the audience. Is there anybody that has any questions for Vikki and Fab? And if so, either come to the mic or shout your question. All right, you might have to keep your mask on while asking the question, though.
First of all, thank you.
I was just talking about you to telling Vikki, making sure that photo is in the show. Go ahead.
So this question is for Fred. So right now there's another museum exhibit in Boston at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts called Writing the Future, Basquiat and the Hip Hop Generation, curated by our mutual friend Greg Tate. And the two key figures in that show are Ramel Z and Jean-Michel Basquiat, who were not only your friends, but you mentored them. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what it means to you to see them in a museum, but also the through line of their work into the hip-hop generation of today.
Right. So I just met this amazing gentleman a moment ago, and he was at an event that kind of was a rehearsal. One of the first kind of examples of hip-hop happening in downtown Manhattan at a little studio in Soho. Sort of an incident happened, so the actual official event didn't happen, but the rehearsal was documented, and the photo of one of the breakdancers, his name is Frosty Freeze, who sadly is no longer with us, is in the show. I think the photo was by Martha Cooper?
That's right.
Right, and so my man just came up and told me the whole story. It blew my mind, because what happened was, once again, the event only had a rehearsal, a full rehearsal. I was rapping, Ramel Z, who was a graffiti artist, and also he had rap skills, he was there. A gang came and a fight happened. It freaked everybody out, so that show never really happened. But the photographer that took the photos of the rehearsal put that image of Frosty Freeze on the cover of one of the most popular cultural newspapers in New York at the time. So that became a really important milestone event, because at that time, nobody except kids in the inner city in New York knew what any of this stuff was. So at that time, I was initially trying to be a painter, trying to create a space where people could look at the graffiti that we used to do on the walls and the trains, and we were beginning to do on canvas. People would look at us as artists. Another gentleman that I met, we were kids at the time, 1920, was a guy by the name of Jean-Michel Basquiat, who sadly passed away really young, but his work resonates around the world. And so Ramel Z, sadly, is also not well. A lot of people have died, sadly. But these guys were all friends, and we all hung out together. We all partied together. We would be at Squat Theater, which is a very important cultural space that had some wild theater, and bands would perform. We would go in there and do rap shows and stuff way before any of this stuff was accepted. So he just blew my mind, reminded me about that. So once again, there was a whole movement of us that some of us found opportunities to show our work, to sell our work, to make a living, to make music, to do all of these different things. And so, but a lot of it is not recognized in spaces like this, which is like a museum on a really major scale. And so there's a show right now at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, which looks not just at Jean-Michel, which is one of the biggest painters on the planet, I mean his legacy, if you will, but it's other people like myself, like Futura 2000, like Lee Quinones, like Lady Pink, like, you know, that were all a part of the scene. We were all hanging out, we were showing together in little galleries and stuff. So the museum has an amazing show that's up, and it's just amazing to see it. Unfortunately, COVID put a damper on it, but it's opened up a bit more now. Once again, the show is called Writing the Future, Basquiat and the Hip Hop Generation at one of America's major museums. And it's a look at all of our work from that period. So it's really just amazing to see, even though it's sad that friends are no longer with us, the idea was that the work would live on and people would connect with the work and see the work and kind of understand what the artists were trying to do at that time. So that was a long answer, but you know.
So,
Hey, Bill.
Hey, what's up, Joseph? So first, I think anytime you're in a room in Abu Dhabi and Greg Tate's name is invoked, you're in the right place. So shout out to Greg Tate. I want to, I guess, ask a question. It's a little bit unformed, but there are a couple of kind of strands that I've been hearing. When you're talking about a lot of the early shots, there was a sense of just the need to document it, you know, and people not being clear why, but they felt like it was historically important. Fab, when you were talking about Wildstyle, that was there. I think in Style Wars, even the graffiti writers in Style Wars were very self-conscious that they wanted to make themselves known. But then later on, like with Vicki's story about Biggie, there was this very conscious, we are going to construct an identity. And now I think everybody on Instagram is hyper-aware all the time that they're constructing their identity. Within the show, it felt like in that corner there, the Run DMC on the streets of Hollis, and for me, the De La Soul shot on the street corner, it feels like there's this transition moment where people are just starting to think about really how they codify their image as opposed to just documenting their reality. And I'm curious if you all can talk a little bit about, were there other things that were happening that led people to start to say, we're going to really control this image that we're going to project out as opposed to document it?
Let me just, I'll take what you said, Bill, and I'll rephrase it for Vicki. Is there a moment where hip-hop artists and the culture become self-conscious of how they're documenting themselves?
I mean, I guess that corresponded with, you know, as hip-hop started being seen on magazines and started being seen on album covers and in videos and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I would say that was when it really people started having teams, right, of like, they just started to realize, like hip-hop started to realize its power at some point, and it was really coincided with it being more commercial, more mainstream, and with media just really starting to integrate with hip-hop a little bit more. But I will say, you know, there is this thing of having your photo taken and seeing the results and branding that moment an important moment that even early on, Jamel Shabazz, who we have photos in the show, he never really photographed anyone famous. He photographed sort of what we would say is street photography now. He would go after work. He had a day job of being a corrections officer at Rikers Island. And as a way to kind of like unwind from that, the hecticness of that job, he would go and take his camera into parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan and photograph just kids that looked incredible and were like stylish, and, you know, he would stop them and he would have them pose, right, rather than capturing them in a more candid style. And he would say to them, you know, because they would say, like, why do you want to take a picture of me? Like, we're just here. Like, I know I look fresh, but, like, no one wants to take my photo. And he would say, I see greatness in you. And he tells this story of how that, you know, set off, like, a light bulb moment in the people that are like, oh, he sees a reason to photograph me. And then they give that energy back in the photo, and you see it. You know, you see that, like, dignity, you see that, like, swagginess, and it all just kind of comes back just from someone saying, like, I see greatness in you, I see an important moment to photograph. So, you know, I also like seeing those early photos. They're not of anyone famous, right? They're just the street culture that hip hop was built on, but it's the same dynamic, right? Of saying, you're important, and I see greatness in you, and I want to photograph it, and you know those stances, then, right?
Yeah. So I'd like to add to that. So in the beginning of hip hop, there was like certain guys in the community in poor neighborhoods that were the strong but also kind of tough and also cool guys, right? So you would know who these individuals were. And you would be like, yo, that dude right there, he's cool. Look what he's wearing. You know you're not going to run up on him and mess with him. That was what a lot of people aspire to be when you're in a jungle type, ghetto, urban environment. You don't want nobody to run up on you, you know? And so the first hip hop artists wanted to emulate. They might not have, most were not that guy. They wanted to look like that guy. So in the Run DMC era, the first guys that came out with the poses and the look and the attitude, they wanted to be that guy that they knew was on the corner, that was the tough, strong guy in the hood. What made Jamel Shabazz's work so incredible, I wrote the foreword to his first book, was he captured the real guys on the corner, the regular guys that were the official, rough, tough guys. And also a part of what he did when he would approach them, when he'd ask these guys, yo, man, y'all look cool, I want to take your picture. And the guys would be like, what? He also would have a little sample of what he had previously did. So he'd open up a little portfolio with a handful of photos, and then they would see other cool guys, and they'd be like, oh, shit, okay, yes, we'll pose for you. And then they get into these classic old school ways of posing, which was a part of it. So I guess in the beginning, guys had this tough image. But then when De La Soul and those guys came out, they were like, no, we're not tough guys. We're not trying to be that. So they came with a whole other aesthetic that became something totally different, and which was genius because everybody was trying to out-tough the other guy in their image and their stance and their attitude. De La Soul, a whole bunch of, I guess, the artists in the native tongue, they opened up a whole other area where you could just be a normal, regular, kind of nerdy, whoever you were, you could be that guy. And if you made good records, you were happening.
And then even taking that further is, you know, we've talked about this, is in the mid-'90s you start getting artists that they don't want to be seen at all. So you've got like MF Doom wearing a mask, right?
Yes.
He's trying to hide his identity a little bit. Even that first Wu-Tang Clan album cover, they've got the masks. Part of the reason is it conveys this sort of like dark, menacing image that the music conveys. The other reason, which most people don't know, is that it's because when Danny Hastings took that photograph, they all didn't show up. And so they couldn't have the album cover with just like 5 of the guys, so the masks made sense. I always like that. And then one thing I also want to add is about Jamel. To me, the counterpoint to Jamel is Ricky Powell, our friend and photographer Ricky Powell, who passed away recently. The thing about Ricky's photos, he's also a street photographer. In Ricky's photos, you see how annoyed they are with Ricky in the images. And I love this about his photos, because Ricky was an acquired taste. And he had no shame in asking people on the street to take their photographs. And you can see in his images, and we have some of his slides back there blown up, some of the people that he asked to take their pictures, they just look really like, okay, Ricky, take the shot. And my favorite one is the Basquiat and Andy Warhol shot. he jumps out at them while they're walking to their joint show in Soho. And Basquiat, who knows Ricky and has had this experience before, he's like, all right, hurry up. And Andy Warhol, who's never met Ricky before, is looking at Ricky like, "What? Who are you? Who is this character?" And so I think that I love the photographers whose presence are in their work, like Jamel and Ricky, and they're sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum.
I would just like to add that there's great documentaries there's a great time for documentaries. So there's a documentary on Jamel Shabazz. If you guys are not familiar with his work, I think it's called Jamel Shabazz Street Photographer. There's a documentary on Ricky Powell that'll be coming out soon, which I think is called Ricky Powell, The Individualist, which just showed at the Tribeca Film Festival, which is amazing. Ricky just passed away, sadly, just within the last 6 months. But he also is known as the fourth Beastie Boys, because when the Beastie Boys happened, Ricky was in their videos and he was on tour with the Beasties and Run DMC. So he also has very early intimate photos, and so, yeah.
There's also a Martha Cooper documentary, which you still have to see, but it's amazing. Martha, whose photos are at the front of the exhibit.
Well, and I'll just give a little shout out to Joseph, because we're also in the process of producing a feature-length Contact High documentary, which Joseph is going to direct. Yes. So that should be ready by end of the year. We're on the fast track. Yeah.
Hopefully.
So hopefully we can come back with that.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be back with that. Okay, do we have time for more questions? Yeah. Okay.
Firstly, I just wanted to say thanks for bringing this exhibition to this part of the region. I have a question for Vikki and Fab. If you had to choose one between the music, the culture, and the visions, what would you choose that inspired the Contact High?
So if I heard your question correctly, if you had to choose between the music, the culture, or the visuals,
correct, yeah.
Which one inspired Contact High the most?
I think it's all wrapped up in one, you know.
Well, the culture is all of those things, right? The music and the visuals are the culture, and the culture are the music and and I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, but I think the bigger answer is you can't separate any of those things. You know, just like you can't separate hip-hop culture from, drug policy, racism, politics, poverty, right? All those things, not to, be Debbie Downer, but these photographs are of celebrities, right? Ultimately, but when you really drill down, you can't separate what this culture has become from what it started as, which was a community that, faced a lot of things, and you can't separate. I always say, you can't take the best of a culture and leave the rest.
There was a moment when Barack Obama was running for office, and he was running against Hillary Clinton. And this was in the campaign. And so in response to something Hillary Clinton had said, there was this moment when Barack Obama was doing answering questions from the press, and somebody asked him about this comment or something that Hillary had said. And what Barack Obama did was this. Okay, so that little gesture came from hip hop. Brush your shoulders off. I think it was a Jay-Z song. It was brush your shoulders off, meaning that's a small thing. So when that moment happened, I remember going, wait a minute, I could see this guy's cool, good politician, campaign was heavy, hard, but I was like, what? And then later, when Barack Obama gets elected, Jay-Z's in the White House, they're hanging out, it was confirmed. Big hip-hop fan, watch Yo MTV Raps, a part of the culture. So that was an example that it was a little symbol, that showed how from this culture has come many kind of methods and modes and things to say, and whether it's just let's have fun and party, let's point out these issues in the country like Chuck D and a lot of rappers that at a time really addressed specific issues that were affecting people. And so that, I think that's just an extension to what Vikki said. But that image of Obama doing that, I was like, wait a minute now. And it was just, he was really that cool.
And I'll just add, like, I think hip hop is like it's an energy. It's a spirit. It's making something out of nothing. It's it's about community. It's about whether that manifests in music, in graffiti, in photography, in making your own magazine. Like, I just think it's an energy that you tap into. All right, another question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, what made you guys want to start doing what you do, like photography and directing music videos?
What made you guys start doing what you do?
Well, boy, what made start? I don't know. I had some creative people around, really smart folks. I just wanted to make some moves and Max Roach was my godfather. That probably had a little influence. He was a very important bebop jazz drummer, and him and my dad grew up together. I don't know. I just felt like, let's make some things happen and try to see what you can do and see if how far you can go with it. And, I was just lucky to make a few things happen and just open doors and bring some other people in with me. Come on, baby, let's get it on, and it kind of just happened like that. I was just really motivated at an early age, I guess. I mean, I was bored and didn't want to, I needed to do something. I was bored, yeah.
No, that's a hard question, and a journalist asked us this earlier today, and I can give this long-winded answer of like being an immigrant kid in Detroit and being so inspired by, being an outsider and resonating with the music. I mean, that's sort of my like emo answer, but I guess, the answer is why does anyone, do what they do is they love it, and they feel at home in it. And I came up in a city and in a place and in a town that the music just spoke to me and the culture spoke to me, and I just said, I want to be part of that. And another part of hip hop is like the get in where you fit in thing. And for me, it was as a writer, and working for the label, and you just kind of go from there. It wasn't so planned or thought out, but it always was from a place of inspiration and love, which I hope you can see, in what the show is, and how we talk about it and how we move in the world. That ultimately this comes from a great place of love and respect and wanting to tell the story.
Cool, thank you. Last question.
Mic check. Hello. My name is Aham. I was part of the Contact High analog photo competition, and my photo's out there. Thank you all for coming from Abu Dhabi. I am from Abu Dhabi. I'm a filmmaker, or now you call it content creator, whatever that is. So I know in photography, like to try to capture the moment, you guys have to go out and be out and about. But this question is specifically for films, more music videos. How do you create a music video by keeping true to the culture without making it cheesy, I guess? Yeah.
Wow. Well, I directed a lot of videos a long time ago for a lot of different artists. It's kind of, I guess honesty is an important thing in terms of what you want to do and say. I think finding a unique way, if you could, to do and say what it is you want to say, something that fits what the artist is doing, sometimes complimenting, sometimes enhancing. As a director of a lot of videos, sometimes I was in situations like where you had an incredible artist who made an incredible song, but personality-wise, he might be kind of like withdrawn. So sometimes you need to be like, look, I think you need to be more of this to match what you were saying and doing on the record. There's a lot of different components of that in the time when I was directing a lot of videos. Unfortunately, because everything happens on your phone, on Instagram, on YouTube, I don't get to see as many. Back in the early days, you turn on Yo MTV, like my show, or this show, and watch what everybody was doing, and then you'd know that worked. Dope song, dope video. I want to do something as good as that or better. Sometimes not the case, so I don't get to see as many. But I think if you have an honest idea, a unique, fresh approach, gotta have a good song. That's key. I remember after I had a good run, the first few videos I did, great songs. Then I remember I got a song and I'm listening to this song over and over, and then I went, wait a minute, this song is trash. And I'm like, wow, but I still had to do the video, but nothing was gonna make it a better song. I'll never forget that moment. I'm not even gonna mention, because the group didn't hang around, but I was doing a favor.
I'm going to tell Naz you said that.
Say what? Yeah, it was just a thing. So that's, I think, the basics, you know. But it's easy to do it now. It's much more expensive before. When I started directing, everything was happening on film. Cameras were expensive. To get your hands on that stuff was like amazing. Like, how do you do it? Literally, I've seen things shot on an iPhone, and my iPhone's kind of old now. There's the iPhone 11, 12, 13, whatever. It's crazy what you can get image-wise, editing, right on. It's crazy. So good luck. I'd love to see what you do whenever you make the video.
Yeah, and thank you for being part of, you know, we have this community and identity contest that we ran, because we really wanted to make a point that, you know, hip-hop and documentation was really so universal, right? So we have the winners outside as you're walking into the exhibit on display.
That's what's up. Congratulations. Damn.
Yeah, so thank you for being part of that. That was super cool.
And I'll just extend that it's not just to filmmaking too, but to anything you create. I think you just have to be honest, right? Like, and it doesn't mean necessarily factually honest. It could be emotionally honest. I think you just have to be honest and authentic, and make sure that you're doing things for the right reasons. Okay, I think that's our time today. I'm getting a little emotional because, like, this means it's the end of the.
I just want to say, like, this has been, in my opinion, the best example of this show. The red wall. You know, I wanted to match the show. That's why I put my red shirt. But no, the scale and the execution of this show here is really spectacular. So it was super great that you guys get to have had this show for so long, and thanks for coming. And we went to the Louvre today, which was also quite impressive, that there's only one other Louvre in the world, and it happens to be here. So you guys got it going on, except for the weather. But and also, I just want to say, the film that Joseph produced, I told him, and it's my favorite. I love documentaries. It's my favorite music film of all time, not just because my godfather, Max Roach, is in the film, which blew me away, but it's an amazing story about an amazing film that happened in Harlem before Woodstock, and nobody got to see this footage because nobody would make this movie accessible to people, and it's going to be in 600 theaters. It's going to be on Hulu. If you guys can see Summer of Soul, the film that Joseph produced and Questlove directed, it's really quite an experience.
Thank you. I think it'll be here July in this region, July 16th. Hopefully, I think.
Whoa.
So, all right. Thank you, everybody.